The city was dead, but it still whispered. Wind moved through broken buildings, carrying the sound of creaking metal and drifting dust. Mark walked slowly, his boots crunching on shattered glass. He had no friends, no home, and no reason to be here except survival. The war had taken everything: his family, his ship, and every person who had once trusted him. He was just a scavenger now. The afternoon light filtered through holes in the walls, painting strange shapes on the floor. Mark checked each room for anything useful: food, tools, maybe an old battery he could trade. But so far, only empty shelves and burned-out machines stared back at him. Then he heard it, a faint tapping sound, not like the wind, like falling debris. It was steady, deliberate. Mark froze. His hand went to the small pistol on his belt. The tapping stopped, then started again. Curiosity pushed him forward. He moved through a narrow hallway, past peeling walls and doors hanging from broken hinges, until he reached what looked like the remains of a loading dock. There, sitting on a piece of rusted metal, was a girl, not human. Her skin was a pale, soft blue, her hair a silvery white that caught the light like threads of ice. She wore a torn orange shirt and dark shorts. Her eyes were wide, watchful, and almost glowing in the dim light. But the thing that made Mark stop cold: she had no legs. Only smooth stumps where they should have been, wrapped in makeshift cloth. She held a small metal rod and had been tapping it against the ground. Not for fun, more like a signal. When she saw Mark, she stiffened. Her thin arms pulled the rod close to her chest. She didn't speak. She only stared, her expression a mix of fear and hope. Mark looked around. No one else was here. No movement. No sound except their breathing. "What are you doing out here?" he asked quietly. No answer. She just tilted her head as if studying his face. "You lost." He tried again. Her lips parted slightly, but instead of words, she shook her head and looked down. Mark noticed something then: a small device strapped to her shirt, half hidden under the cloth. It had tiny blinking lights and symbols he didn't recognize. He crouched a little, trying not to scare her. "You alone?" This time she gave the smallest nod. Mark's throat tightened. Alone in this city, with no legs. He knew what happened. Two people like her when gangs or scavenger crews found them. Before he could speak again, a sound echoed from somewhere in the distance: heavy footsteps and the low murmur of alien voices. The girl's eyes went wide. She dropped the rod and glanced toward the noise, then back at Mark, almost as if asking him something without words. Mark didn't think. He just moved. "Come on," he whispered, stepping forward. He slipped an arm under her, lifting her carefully but quickly. She was lighter than he expected. Her small hands clung to his shirt, trembling. The voices grew louder, boots against metal, the sound of weapons being checked. Mark hurried down the hall, his heart pounding. He ducked into a half-collapsed storage room, pushing aside a broken door. Inside, the air smelled of rust and damp stone. He set her down gently behind a stack of crates. "Stay here," he whispered. "Don't make a sound." She looked up at him, her eyes full of something he couldn't read. Fear, yes, but also trust. Mark drew his pistol and moved to the doorway. Through a crack, he saw three figures in battered armor moving through the loading dock. Alien scavengers. They had bladed rifles slung across their backs and heavy boots that clanged against the floor. One of them was scanning the ground with a handheld device. They were hunting someone. Mark's eyes narrowed. He didn't know who this girl was, but he understood one thing: if they found her, she wouldn't survive. One of the scavengers stopped near the rusted metal where she had been sitting. He crouched, picked up the small rod she'd been tapping, and examined it. Then he said something in a harsh, guttural language. The others turned, scanning the area. Mark pulled back, breathing slow and quiet. He looked over his shoulder at the girl. She was still there, still watching him, her fingers gripping the side of the crate. The footsteps came closer. Mark knew he had two choices: leave her and slip away, or stay and fight, and for reasons he didn't fully understand yet. Leaving wasn't an option. The scene ended with him tightening his grip on his weapon, waiting for the scavengers to come through the door. Mark's heartbeat thudded in his ears. The air inside the ruined storage room was hot and stale, but his focus stayed on the doorway. The shadows of the scavengers moved closer, their boots clanging against the metal floor like war drums. The girl didn't move. She sat as still as a statue, her large glowing eyes locked on him. She didn't know him, didn't even know his name, but in this moment, she was silently trusting him with her life. Mark raised his pistol, every muscle in his arm tense. He wasn't a soldier anymore, but old instincts still lived in him. The first scavenger stepped into view, his helmet cracked and his armor mismatched from years of patchwork repairs. A long knife hung from his belt. His nostrils flared as if he could smell them. Mark's breath slowed. He waited until the scavenger took one more step into the room. Then he moved. He lunged forward, smashing the pistol into the alien's jaw. Before the creature could shout, the scavenger stumbled back with a grunt, his knife clattering to the floor. Mark grabbed him by the armor, yanked him deeper into the room, and struck again, this time knocking him out cold. The other two shouted, rushing toward the door. Mark fired twice, the blasts lighting the room in harsh white flashes. One scavenger fell, clutching his shoulder, while the other ducked behind the wall and fired back. Metal sparked as shots tore into the crates. The girl flinched but didn't scream. She pressed her hands to her ears and stayed low. Mark grabbed the unconscious scavenger's rifle and returned fire, forcing the last one to retreat into the hallway. He didn't waste time chasing him. More would come. He turned to the girl. "We're leaving." She blinked, her lips parting like she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Mark crouched, sliding his arms under her again. She weighed almost nothing. He could feel how thin she was, like she hadn't eaten properly in days. They slipped out the back of the storage room, moving through a narrow service corridor that smelled of oil and dust. The girl's head rested against his chest, but her eyes darted around, watching every shadow. After several turns, they reached a collapsed section of the building where daylight poured in through twisted beams. Outside was the wasteland, miles of broken roads, scattered wreckage, and the skeletons of ships too damaged to fly. Mark set her down on a flat piece of concrete so he could check the area. The horizon shimmered with heat, but no movement caught. His eye, "You can talk?" he asked gently. She hesitated, then nodded once. "What's your name?" "Lyra," she whispered, her voice soft and musical. Mark gave a small nod. "I'm Mark." Lyra looked at him for a long moment. Then, very quietly, she said, "Why? Why what? Why help me?" Her voice was almost trembling, but her eyes stayed fixed on his face. Mark didn't answer right away. He could have said it was because she was just a kid, or because leaving her felt wrong. But the truth was, he didn't really know. Maybe it was because she was as alone as he was. Before he could reply, the sound of engines roared in the distance. Dust clouds rose on the horizon speeders. Mark's jaw tightened. "We have to move." He slung the scavenger's rifle across his back and crouched in front of her. "Hold on to me." She wrapped her thin arms around his neck, and he lifted her again, breaking into a run across the cracked ground. His boots pounded against stone as the sound of the speeders grew louder. They weaved between piles of wreckage, using the shadows of rusted ships to stay hidden. Mark's breath grew heavy, but he didn't slow down. Finally, they reached an old maintenance tunnel entrance half buried in sand. He ducked inside, the cool darkness swallowing them. Mark set Lyra down against the wall and listened. The speeders passed by overhead, their engines fading. Lyra exhaled shakily, looking at him with something that almost resembled relief. "You shouldn't have done this," she said softly. Mark raised an eyebrow. "Why not? They'll hunt. You now? They'll never stop." Mark gave a small, humorless smile. "They can try." But inside, he knew she wasn't wrong. He had just made himself a target, and as he looked at her, sitting there in the dim light, clutching a small, blinking device strapped to her chest, he realized something. Whatever trouble she was in, it was bigger than just a random gang of scavengers. Bigger and far more dangerous. The tunnel was cold and damp, lit only by the thin strips of daylight that slipped in through cracks in the metal ceiling. Dust floated lazily in the air, and every distant echo made Mark tense. He sat with his back against the wall, rifle across his lap, breathing quietly as he listened for signs of pursuit. Lyra was across from him, leaning against a slanted piece of wall plating. Her small hands were wrapped around the strange device strapped to her chest. The blinking light on it pulsed in a slow rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't comfortable, it was heavy, like both of them were thinking the same thing but waiting for the other to speak first. Finally, Mark broke it. "That thing you're holding, what is it?" Her fingers tightened over it. "It's mine," she said softly, looking away. "That's not an answer," Mark replied, his voice calm but firm. "I need to know why those scavengers were after you. I need to know what you're carrying." She stared at the ground for a long moment before speaking again. "It's a core, a power core." Mark frowned, like from a ship. She shook her head. "Bigger, stronger. My people use them to power cities. Or weapons." Mark's gaze sharpened. "Weapons." She met his eyes then. "If they put it in the wrong hands, it can destroy an entire settlement in one shot." Mark's jaw tightened. He'd seen enough destruction in his life to know she wasn't exaggerating. "And you're carrying it? Why?" "Because if I didn't," she whispered, "they would have it already." He studied her for a moment. She looked too fragile, too young to be mixed up in something like this. Aha! And yet, here she was, clutching something people would kill for. "Where are your people now?" he asked. Her expression darkened. "Gone. They left when the city fell. I was too slow." She glanced at the stumps where her legs should have been. "I slowed them down so they left me behind." Mark's chest tightened. He didn't say it out loud, but he understood the kind of cruelty she was talking about. He'd been left behind too by friends, by comrades, by people who decided he wasn't worth the trouble. "All right," he said finally. "So they left you. Now you're stuck with that thing, and everyone out there wants it. That means we have to get it somewhere safe." Lyra tilted her head. "Why we? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Mark gave a faint smirk. "Maybe not. But I'm not the kind of person who leaves someone to die in the dirt, especially not someone carrying a bomb that could wipe out half the sector." Her eyes softened slightly, but there was still caution there. "If you stay with me, they'll come for you too. They can try," he said again. But this time there was no humor in his voice. Before she could answer, a distant rumble shook the tunnel. Sand sifted down from the ceiling. Mark was on his feet instantly, scanning the shadows. "They found the tunnel," he muttered. Lyra's eyes widened. "How? Maybe they were tracking you. That device, it might have a signal." She looked horrified. "No, it's locked. Only I can." She stopped suddenly, her face going pale. Mark caught the look and knew what it meant. They hacked it. He grabbed her and lifted her into his arms again. "We're moving now." They ran deeper into the tunnel, their footsteps echoing off the walls. The rumble grew louder, followed by the whine of hover engines. Light beams flickered in the distant searchlights, cutting through the darkness. Mark turned a corner sharply, spotting a service hatch half buried in rubble. He kicked away the debris and forced it open, the rusty hinges screaming in protest. They climbed into a side shaft that sloped upward, the air growing warmer as they went. Behind them, the sound of shouting grew louder. At last, they emerged into the open air, the sunlight almost blinding after the tunnel's darkness. They were on the edge of a vast canyon, with jagged cliffs stretching for miles. Mark set Lyra down and crouched beside her. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We can't outrun them forever. That core is as dangerous as you say. We need to make a plan to get rid of Itor, hide it where no one will ever find it." Lyra hesitated, then reached. Alton took his hand. "If we do this, we do it together." Mark nodded once. Together. But in the distance, the engines were growing louder again. And he knew this was only the beginning. The heat rolled off the canyon floor like waves from an invisible ocean. Mark kept low, moving between jagged rocks with Lyra clinging to his back. Every few minutes he glanced over his shoulder, scanning for dust trail signs that the scavenger speeders were closing in. They had no vehicle, no allies, and no clear plan. Just distance. And distance didn't last long when the enemy had engines. The wasteland stretched endlessly around them, broken roads, sun-bleached ship hulls half buried in sand, and rusted metal towers leaning like dying trees. It wasn't the kind of place anyone survived without knowing every shadow to hide in and every path to avoid. Mark knew some, not all. Lyra was quiet, her chin resting on his shoulder, but he could feel the tension in her grip. She wasn't used to being carried for this long, and her breathing told him she was fighting to stay calm. "We'll find somewhere to stop," he said quietly. "Somewhere they won't look." Her voice was small. "There's nowhere they won't look." Mark didn't argue. She wasn't wrong. But sometimes hope was as important as air. They reached the skeleton of a crashed freighter, a massive ship broken in half, its hull scattered like bones. Mark ducked inside one of the larger pieces, setting Lyra down gently. The air inside was cooler, the light dim. It smelled of rust and oil, but it was shelter. He walked through the wreckage, checking each corner before returning. "We can rest here for a bit, but not too long." Lyra nodded, but her eyes were on something else. In old hoversled, half buried under twisted metal. Mark followed her gaze. The sled was small, battered, and missing parts. One of its repulsor pads was cracked clean through. But it was a start. "You think it can work?" she asked softly. Mark crouched beside it. "If I can get it running, we'll move faster then." On foot, he glanced at her. "It won't be perfect, but perfect isn't the goal. Moving without getting caught, that's the goal." She gave the smallest smile. "Then we should fix it." Mark started clearing the debris around the sled, using a bent piece of hull to pry away panels. His hands worked fast, his mind cataloging. What was broken, what could be repaired, and what could be bypassed? Years ago, he'd been an engineer on a freighter crew. Those skills had kept him alive more times than he could count. Lyra watched him closely. "You've done this before?" "A few times," he said with a faint smirk. As he worked, she spoke again. "You know, you could leave. They're after me, not you." Mark didn't even look up. "I already told you I'm not leaving." "Why?" "You don't even have friends," she said. The words blunt, but without malice. Mark paused, the wrench in his hand tightening. "That's exactly why," he said finally. "Because I know what it's like to be left behind." Lyra didn't answer, but her gaze softened. She reached into the small pouch tied to her side and pulled out a handful of wires and connectors. "These might help," she said, offering them. Mark took them with a nod. "They will." Hours passed in slow, tense work. The sun sank lower, painting the wasteland in gold and blood-red light. Outside, the faint hum of distant engines came and went, sometimes near, sometimes far. Finally, Mark tightened the last bolt and stepped back. The sled's repulsors hummed weakly, but held steady. "It'll run," he said. "Not fast, not far, but far enough to get us somewhere safer." Lyra's eyes brightened for the first time since he'd met her. "Then we should go before a sharp whine split the air." Not from the sled, from above. Mark's head snapped up. Through a gap in the freighter's hull, he saw a small drone, swooping low, scanning the wreck. Its lights flashed red as it locked onto them. "Down!" Mark shouted, grabbing Lyra and pulling her behind a piece of hull, just as the drone fired a burst of plasma. The metal sizzled and warped where the blast hit. Mark raised the scavenger rifle and fired back, clipping the drone's wing. Sparks flew, and it spiraled into the sand with a shriek of twisting metal. But the damage was done. The drone signal would have already gone out. "They'll be here in minutes," Mark said grimly. He lifted Lyra onto the sled, securing her in place. "Hold on." The sled shuddered as he powered it up. It floated unsteadily for a moment, then steadied. Mark climbed on behind her and steered it through a narrow gap in the wreck, kicking up sand as they shot into the open wasteland behind them. The engines of incoming speeders grew louder. Lyra glanced back, her voice tight. "They're faster." "Yeah," Mark said, eyes scanning the horizon. "But they don't know the way I'm taking." He turned sharply toward a jagged ridge ahead, guiding the sled into the shadows between the rocks. The sound of the speeders roared behind them, but the canyon ahead promised at least a little cover. For now, the canyon walls rose high on both sides, blocking the worst of the sun. The hover sled hummed quietly as Mark guided it along a winding path. The sound of the scavenger's speeders had faded for now, but both he and Lyra knew it wouldn't. Last, they needed fuel, food, and a place to hide, preferably all at once. Mark slowed the sled when he spotted a small settlement wedged into the canyon wall. It wasn't much, just a handful of huts, a trading post, and a few old cargo containers stacked into crude shelters. A weather-beaten banner with faded alien symbols fluttered weakly in the hot wind. "This place safe?" Lyra asked, her voice wary. Mark didn't answer right away. "Safe enough, if you know who to talk to." He parked the sled near the edge of the settlement and helped her down. The moment they stepped onto the cracked ground, eyes followed them, suspicious, curious, calculating. A human in this part of the wasteland was rare. A human carrying a young alien girl with no legs. Even rarer, Mark led her toward a rusted door at the far end of the trading post. He knocked twice in a pattern, then once more after a pause. The door opened just enough for a man's face to appear, rough features, a patchy beard, and a mechanical eye that whirred as it focused on Mark. "Didn't expect to see you alive," the man said. "Didn't expect to be," Mark replied. "Need supplies, fuel cells. Maybe a place to stay a few hours." The man's gaze flicked to Lyra, lingering on the blinking device strapped to her chest. "And who's this?" "Not your concern," Mark said sharply. The man shrugged and opened the door wider. "Come in." Inside, the air was cooler. The place smelled of old oil and stale drink. Metal shelves held scattered tools, spare parts, and half-empty crates. Mark set Lyra in a chair near the wall while he spoke quietly with the man. His name was Harlan, an old contact from years ago when Mark still worked salvage. Harlan fetched a fuel cell and a small pack of rations. "That'll do you for a day or two," he said. Mark reached for his pouch. "How much?" "For you?" Harlan smiled thinly. "We'll work something out." Mark didn't like the sound of that. "What do you want?" Harlan leaned on the counter, his eyes sliding toward Lyra again. "Word is, there's a big bounty on a certain little alien carrying stolen tech. And I'm looking right at her." Mark's hand went to the rifle on his back. "Don't." Harlan raised his palms in mock surrender. "Easy, I'm just saying. You're running yourself into the ground for someone you barely know. You could walk away right now with more credits than you'd see in 10 lifetimes." Lyra's gaze dropped to the floor, her shoulders tense. She didn't speak, but her hands gripped the edge of the chair tightly. Mark's voice was low and cold. "I'm not selling her." Harlan's smile faded. Shame. Could have made it easy. To happen fast. Two men stepped out from a side. Room rifles already aimed. Mark spun toward them, but a sharp crack rang out. Something hard slammed into the back of his head. The world tilted, then went black dot. When Mark woke, his wrists were bound with thick cable. His head throbbed, and the dim light told him he was still in Harlan's place, but Lyra was gone. He pulled against the restraints, his voice rough. "Where is she?" Harlan stood near the door, checking a datapad. "Already on her way to the buyer. You should thank my left you alive." Mark's blood boiled. "You have no idea what you've done." Harlan smirked. "I know exactly what I've done. And when I'm rich, maybe I'll send you a thank you gift." Mark scanned the room. A cracked pipe in the corner hissed with escaping steam. A loose panel in the floor caught his eye. He shifted toward it slowly, keeping his movements subtle. Harlan turned to pour himself a drink. And Mark moved, slamming his foot down on the panel, snapping it free. The sharp edge cut into the cable around his wrists. Harlan heard the snap and turned, but Mark was already free. In 2 strides, he was across the room, slamming Harlan into the wall. The man's drink shattered on the floor. "Where?" Mark snarled. Harlan coughed, his mechanical eye spinning wildly. "East Ridge. They'll take her through the canyon pass." Mark shoved him aside, grabbed his rifle, and kicked the door open. The hot air hit him like a wave, but he didn't slow. He jumped onto the hoversled, fired it up, and shot out of the settlement at full speed. The sun was sinking low, casting long shadows across the jagged terrain. Ahead, the canyon pass loomed like the throat of some great beast stand somewhere inside. Lyra was in the hands of people who would kill her without a second thought. Mark's grip tightened on the controls. They had no idea what was coming for them. The hoversled screamed through the canyon, its repulsors kicking up dust and shards of stone. Mark leaned low over the controls, his eyes fixed on the narrowing pass ahead. The wind tore at his clothes, but his mind was sharper than ever. Every second counted. He had been in enough fights to know that charging blindly into an enemy camp was suicide, but this wasn't just any fight. This was about Lyra, and he'd rather die trying to get her back than live knowing he'd let them take her. The canyon walls opened into a wide basin. Down below, half hidden among jagged rocks, was the scavenger camp. Smoke rose from crude cooking fires. Speeders sat in neat rows. And in the center, surrounded by armed guards, was a cage. Lyra was inside. Even from here, Mark could see her sitting on the ground, her hands gripping the bars, her eyes locked on the device strapped to her chest. She looked unharmed, but tense, watching. The guards with the focus of someone counting every move. Mark parked the sled behind an outcrop and crept closer on foot, rifle ready. The sun was dipping toward the horizon, turning the rocks blood red. It was the perfect light for an ambush. 2 guards stood near the cage, speaking in low, guttural tones. Mark stayed in the shadows until one of them turned away. Then he moved, like a striking predator, quick, silent, and precise. The first guard went down with a rifle, butt to the jaw. The second barely had time to shout before Mark grabbed him, yanking him into the shadows and knocking him out cold, inside the cage. Lyra's eyes widened. "Mark, quiet," he said, working at the lock. But the crude mechanism wasn't going to open without a key or explosives, and explosives would alert the entire camp. Lyra's gaze shifted to the guard's belt, lying just outside the bars, keys there. Mark reached for it, but a shout rang out from the other side of the camp. A guard had spotted him. The camp exploded into chaos. Rifles were raised, boots thundered across the dirt, and shouts echoed off the canyon. Walls. Mark tossed the key to Lyra through the bars. "Open it from inside." She fumbled with it, her small hands shaking. Mark turned to face the oncoming guards, firing short, controlled bursts to keep them pinned down. The air filled with the smell of burnt metal and the crack of plasma fire. The lock clicked. Lyra shoved the door open. "Mark, behind you." He spun just as a massive alien swung a club the size of a steel beam. The blow missed his head by inches, slamming into the dirt with enough force to make the ground shudder. Mark fired point blank, the blast dropping the brute where he stood. "Can you move fast enough?" he asked, glancing at her stumps. She shook her head, then grinned faintly. "But I can make them slower." Before Mark could ask, she yanked the device from her chest, twisted 2 wires, and slammed it against the ground. It began to hum low. At first, then rising into a sharp, pulsing whine. "What are you doing?" Mark demanded. "It's not just a power core," she said. "Can scramble electronics." As the pitch climbed, the guards' rifles sparked and went dead. The speeders in the distance sputtered and fell silent. Even Mark's rifle fizzled in his hands. The scavengers shouted in confusion. Some drawing crude melee weapons, others retreating. To the shadows, time to go. Lyra said. Mark scooped her up and sprinted toward the far side of the camp, weaving between panicked guards. Without their weapons, most were too stunned to stop him. The sled was still hidden where he'd left. He threw Lyra onto the back and jumped onto the controls. The repulsors kicked to life with a satisfying hum. As they shot away from the camp, the hum of the device faded, and the scavenger shouts grew distant. Lyra leaned against him, breathing hard but smiling faintly. "You're insane, Mark," said, shaking his head. "Takes one to know one," she replied. They didn't slow until the canyon walls swallowed the last trace of the camp. The night air was cool, the stars beginning to peek through the deepening sky. Mark glanced at her. "You risked blowing that thing up back there?" She shrugged. "It was worth it." Then her smile faded. "But it's overheating now. If we don't fix it soon, it might not just scramble electronics next time." Mark tightened his grip on the controls. "Then we'll fix it together." But in the back of his mind, he knew the next challenge wouldn't just be keeping it out of the wrong hands, it would be stopping it from killing them both. The wasteland at night was a different world. The air was cooler, the wind quieter, and the stars stretched overhead like a million watching eyes. The hover sled skimmed over cracked stone and shallow dunes, its hum the only sound between them. Mark kept his eyes on the horizon. Lyra sat in front of him, leaning slightly against his chest, holding the now silent device in her hands. Its blinking light had faded to a weak pulse, the heat from it still seeping through her fingers. "How long before it fails completely?" Mark asked. Lyra shook her head. "Not long. Maybe hours. If it overheats again, it could destroy itself. And take us with it." Mark's jaw tightened. "Then we need to decide where it goes. Can we hide it?" She was silent for a moment. "If we bury it, they'll find it eventually. If we destroy it, my people lose a power source that could keep a colony alive for decades." She looked down. "But in the wrong hands, it's a weapon. A big one. Mark thought about that. The galaxy was full of people who would burn the world for a handful. Of credits, he'd met too many of them. What if we give it to someone who can use it for the right reason? Lyra turned to look at him. Like who? I know a place, Mark said after a pause. A human outpost, small, but honest. They take in refugees. They don't care about your species, just whether you're willing to help. If we take it there, they could use it to power the settlement and keep it out of the hands of scavengers. Her eyes studied him for a long time. You'd just give it away, not sell it. Mark gave a faint smile. I've had enough money in my life to know it doesn't fix anything. But this, he nodded, toward the device, this could keep people alive. She exhaled slowly. Then we'll take it there. Hours later, they crested a ridge. Below, faint lights glowed in the darkness, a cluster of domes and towers surrounded by a high fence. It looked small against the endless wasteland, but there was a warmth to it, like an island of hope in a dead sea. As they approached, a pair of guards stepped forward, rifles ready. Mark stopped the sled and raised his hands. One of the guards frowned. Haven't seen a human here in years. His eyes slid to Lyra. And you've got company. We need to speak to whoever runs this place, Mark said. We have something that belongs in safe hands. They were led to a large central dome, where a woman in worn but clean clothes sat behind a desk covered in tools and maps. She looked them over without surprise, as if she'd seen every kind of stranger walk through her door. Mark placed the device on the desk. This is a power core, strong enough to run your outposts for decades, or strong enough to wipe out half a city. It's dangerous, but we trust you to use it right. The woman's eyes narrowed. And why give this to us? You could sell it to the highest bidder. Mark glanced at Lyra, then back at the woman. Because some things are worth more than credits. The woman studied them both, then nodded slowly. We'll take it, and we'll guard it. Relief washed over Lyra's face. She unstrapped the device and slid it toward the woman. Promise me you won't let it be used for war. You have my word, the woman said. When they stepped outside, the night was quiet again. Mark expected Lyra to look back at the dome. But she was watching him instead. You didn't have to do any of this, she said softly. You didn't have to help me, or save me, or stay. I know, Mark said. But I wanted to. She hesitated, then smiled, small, but real. Then I guess you're not alone anymore. Mark chuckled. Neither are you. They stood. There for a moment, two outcasts who had found each other in the ruins of a broken galaxy. The past couldn't be changed, but the future. The future was theirs to decide. When they left the outpost, it wasn't as a lonely human and a legless alien girl. It was as a team, a family of two, and somewhere in the galaxy's endless darkness. They had just lit a small, stubborn light one that no one could put out.